Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro. With me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. It's the messiest, most publicised divorce of the decade, Brexit. The United Kingdom is struggling to get a separation agreement with the European Union, and one of the key sticking points seems to be the so-called backstop deal. Welcome, Robert.
Good morning, Bruce.
What is this backstop deal that people are so up in arms about?
The backstop deal is essentially a safety net to ensure that Britain remains, and Northern Ireland remains, in the customs union until a definitive trade agreement is made between the EU and a post-Brexit Britain. And what should be explained here is that this is a way of avoiding a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. It should be recalled that there was a lot of violence in Northern Ireland, and in the Good Friday Agreement in the late 90s brought that violence to an end. But as part of that deal, which was supported by both the Republic of Ireland and Britain, as well as the UN and the EU, as part of the deal was an agreement that there should not be a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So this backstop is an attempt to keep the current arrangements in play until a trade agreement can be negotiated between the UK outside the EU and the EU.
So does everybody want this backstop deal?
Oh no. In many respects, it's seen by both the Remainers and particularly the Leave camp as undesirable. For the die-hard Brexiteers, they see this, they have grave concerns that Britain is going to be locked into the customs union almost indefinitely. And that is, from their point of view, the whole point of leaving is so that Britain could negotiate its own trade deals. This would prevent that. So there's a fear that the backstop may become semi-permanent. And for the Remainers, of course, this arrangement is worse than the full-blooded customs union, which is currently available as a member of the EU. And the Remainers would argue that this Britain will become a rule taker rather than a rule maker, because it will have to accept a customs union without any say in the arrangements within the EU. So both sides are opposed to it.
I imagine that a lot's going on behind the scenes at the moment. What do you guess is going on behind the scenes?
Well, what we know in the last 24 hours is that the no dealers, as they sometimes call, that's the European Research Group, the hardline Brexiteers, have passed a motion of no confidence, and that led to a vote within the 1922 committee. And I think we've just learned that Mrs May has survived that vote. But at the end of the day, Britain is in a constitutional mess. It's become the laughingstock of the world in many respects. Why? Because the EU, a group of liberal democracies, 27 countries, have already indicated that they will not change the deal, which led to the motion of no confidence in Mrs May. Mrs May apparently has been reconfirmed as Prime Minister, but she has little prospect of getting any changes to the deal which is causing these convulsions. So it's a pretty messy situation at the moment.
Right. And how much does the figure of Theresa May matter? Does it matter in the end if she's dropped as Prime Minister?
That's an interesting question. For the Brexiteers, it matters a lot. But I think actually, and for Mr Corbyn, it may matter a lot, because they both believe, both the Brexiteers and Mr Corbyn and his entourage believe in Brexit. They just believe that Mrs May's pursuing the wrong type of Brexit. The reality is, the problem actually is Brexit itself. It's not the type of Brexit. It's very difficult for a country like the UK to extricate itself after 40 years of integration with the EU in a painless fashion. And every scenario which has been published by the UK Treasury shows that whatever Brexit you go for, Britain is substantially worse off. And that's a reality, unfortunately, which will sooner or later make itself felt. It should be pointed out to the listeners that about 46% of Britain's exports go to the EU. So we're talking about Britain leaving a single market where 46% of its exports go with no ready replacements in line. And so it's a high risk scenario.
What about New Zealand? What does New Zealand stand to gain or lose depending on what happens?
I think New Zealand's plans for a free trade agreement with the EU will be uninterrupted by this process, and the New Zealand government has made it quite clear any free trade agreement with the EU takes priority over a free trade agreement with Britain. But I'm sure that they will pursue a free trade agreement with Britain in due course. It's just that negotiating a free trade agreement with a single market of 520 million, the most prosperous single market in the world, takes priority over negotiating a free trade agreement of 65 million people. So I think in that sense, New Zealand, it will not be gravely affected. Its plans are well in train there. I think where New Zealand probably and Canada and other liberal democracies need to perhaps think hard is whether they are comfortable about a referendum in which there have been clear breaches of law. And at the moment, the biggest donor to the referendum for the Leave side, Mr. Aaron Banks, is under a national investigation by the National Crime Agency. He can't account for how he managed to donate £8 million to the Leave side. That meant, during the referendum, the Leave side overspent by 10% in a referendum which was decided by just 3.8%. It's incumbent on New Zealand and other liberal democracies to express concerns about the outcome of a referendum which was fundamentally flawed in legal terms. And sooner or later there are going to be some hard questions and perhaps criminal actions about what's happened.
Is New Zealand, is Canada, any of these other liberal democracies making any of those comments?
They may be doing them discreetly. Certainly academics like myself and Professor David Welsh have written both in Canadian newspapers and in New Zealand newspapers that this was an issue which is a matter of concern. After all, if you can't uphold the rule of a law in liberal democracy successfully, then everything else is at risk. And what we do know about the British referendum in 2016, not only was there illegal money involved, not only there was systematic data breaches, but there was also the prospect of Russian interference as well. So there is a lot of controversy around the EU referendum. Why hasn't Mrs May addressed these issues? Well, politically she has been the biggest beneficiary of the outcome of the referendum. She became Prime Minister.
Thank you for helping us unpick that, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Slán leat.